Well, welcome to today's virtual Chelsea Ask a Gardening Advisor session. And it's a special members session today. We've got questions from across the RHS membership representing a wide range of the sort of questions that are regularly asked to the advisor team throughout the course of the year. My name is Matthew Wilson. I'm a garden designer, should be at Chelsea this week, and a former RHS curator. I ran Harlow Car in Yorkshire and Hyde Hall in Essex. And joining me today, we have three brilliant horticultural minds, which I'll let them introduce themselves. Martin, over to you.
Hello, I'm Martin Fish. I'm a gardener, a garden writer and an RHS judge. And today, yes, I would also be at Chelsea.
James.
Hello, I'm James Lawrence. I'm a Principal Horticultural Advisor for the RHS and a former lecturer in horticulture and garden design. Michaela.
Hello, I'm Michaela. I'm a advisor here at Wisley, previously several years in horticultural retail.
Fantastic. So there's our lineup for today. Let's get cracking with the questions. We've got quite a few here. The first one's from John Bramble from Kent, and he's asking, I'm looking to purchase a small ornamental tree with interest in more than one season. Could the team please recommend a selection? Martin.
Right, well, we don't know how small you want this, John, but one that I would go for, one which I recently planted in my garden, I've got the perfect space, is an Amelanchier. And there are various types of Amelanchier, but the one I've gone for is one that hasn't been around all that long. It's one called Obelisk, and it lives up to its name because it just basically produces a column of growth. So ideal for a small garden, even a large container. It's a naturally upright habit, only grows to about 1 metre in width. So you've got this lovely upright growth on there, probably grows to about 4 meters eventually, but it's not a fast growing tree, but it's grown because it has lovely green leaves. It's got beautiful white blossom in spring. And for me, where I live in North Yorkshire, that's usually around April, but you're in Kent, so probably a little bit earlier. So you get the blossom and then you get the wonderful autumn colour from October onwards. So you've got interest all through the seasons and the sculptural effect for the branches through the winter. So I definitely go for Amelanchier Obelisk.
James, what about you?
I think there's plenty of prunus or flowering cherries that might fit into this category. There's one called Pandora, which might be particularly suitable. Some lovely single pink flowers in the spring, and you've got a really nice bronze tint to the foliage as well. And then a really good autumn leaf colour change. So you get that really good combination between the two seasons, gives you that interest which you can extend through the year.
And I'm a man of Kent, so Kent, of course, famous for its fruit trees, for its apple trees. So I'm going to suggest a Malus, but not a Malus domestica type, but one of the crab apples, Malus sargentii, which is a really lovely, graceful, compact crab apple, white blossom, and then it's followed by small, and they really are quite small, unusually small for a crab apple, red crabs, and a decent amount of autumn colour. And that will only get to probably 1.5 meters high and graceful arching habit. Beautiful thing. Our next question is from Andrew Webb, and he's in Somerset. I'd like to move some established shrubs from one area of my garden to another. Please, can you advise me how and when to do this? Michaela.
There are evergreen shrubs and deciduous shrubs. Moving deciduous shrubs through the winter, from the autumn till beginning of March. The evergreen shrubs you move in the spring. There are a couple of things that you must do. Prepare the planting hole first, the new planting hole first. Water the shrub the day before you move it very well. And also prune any dead or damaged branches. And you can also prune 1/3 of the growth off before you move it.
Martin, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree. Moving them, the dormant season for deciduous or late winter, early spring for the evergreens. I think what you could do now, because obviously you've missed the season for this year, Andrew, is to prepare those shrubs ready for moving next season. And what you can do is just push your spade in about sort of a foot, 18 inches, depending how big the shrub is, away from the trunk, vertically all the way round in a circle, or even dig a little trench, and that will cut through one or two of the roots. And what it will do, it will encourage more fibrous roots to grow within that root ball. And if you can do that now, probably water it if the weather's dry as well, just so you don't cause any stress to the plant. That will encourage a better root system. So when you do move them, you've got a nice compact root ball that you can lift out, because it literally is all about the more root you can get, the greater the success of moving them will be. So it'll just make life a little bit easier when you come to do them.
Great advice. I will add one very small thing, that if you're moving roses, it's a really good idea to cut them right down hard. I've done that every time I've moved a rose, and I find that they bounce back actually much more quickly than if you leave all the top growth on. Okay, we're on to Yorkshire now, Martin. Mrs. Rivers, dry shady area under some trees where nothing much seems to thrive. What shall I do to improve the conditions, and are there any plants you can recommend that would perform well in this tricky spot? Let's go to, I think I'm gonna have a stab at this first, because I've got exactly that. In fact, I was admiring it this morning as I was walking down to my design studio here. Silene fimbriata, beautiful thing. It's one of the campions, and it's a bladder campion, so it has this distinctive bladder shape behind the flower, and the flower itself is a sort of very white, frilly, lovely thing, held on delicate arching stems, decent foliage, and you look at it and you think that would never tolerate dry shade, and it is as tough as old boots, and it does tend to spread quite nicely, not aggressively. I've just actually taken some divisions this year and filled it in some other areas of the border that's very dry. I've got it growing under a hawthorn tree where you should think nothing would really get going, and it does incredibly well. So there we are, Silene fimbriata. Martin.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. I mean, I think first thing, Mrs. Rivers, is to try and improve the soil, because if it's dry shade and you've got trees, you've probably got lots of roots there near the surface from the trees. So I think anything you can do to help the soil retain a little bit more of moisture and create that sort of woodlandy effect is going to help. So organic matter, homemade compost, if you can buy some of the recycled compost, or if you've got access to any well-rotted manure, that will all help to seal in the moisture and make the plants thrive when you do put them in. There are various things. I've got an area with some big trees, and I've got big blocks of things like vinca in there. And I know a lot of people don't like vinca, but there's some really interesting vincas, lovely coloured flowers, variegated foliage. I've got one called Illumination, which has got a golden green variegated leaf. It's vinca minor, so it doesn't go mad, but it looks good all year round. And then we get the violet flowers. Things like epimedium will grow in fairly dry conditions as well. And I plant sort of carpets of geranium macrorrhizum, the pink one, and the alba form, the white flowering one. And they do very well, and they're all sort of evergreen, so you've got cover in the winter. But I would say whatever you put in there, make sure, although they will grow in dry conditions when they're established, you've got to keep them watered until they get the roots down. But yeah, things will grow. Have a go at it.
And James, that sort of early stage, that soil improvement and watering is so critical, isn't it?
It is, yes. And I think, as Martin says, some things need a little bit more water, a little bit more attention in the first year, in particular, to get them established. But then the idea is to try and wean them off that and let them kind of cope for themselves. I mean, I agree with all those plant selections, and a few other things I would add include, there are some ferns, for example, which would do quite well in dry shade, once they've gone through that establishment period. So things like Asplenium, some of the Dryopteris, like Dryopteris affinis, and even things like Polysticum setiferum. So these are all ferns that can cope with dry shade once you get them through that kind of first year. So keep them well watered in the first year, apply some mulch to help keep the moisture in, but only apply that mulch when the soil is already damp, so you trap some of that moisture in, and they will soon establish well.
Excellent. Now we're moving from Yorkshire to Cornwall. We are getting about. This is Anthony Worrell from Cornwall. And he says, I'm planning my summer hanging baskets and have traditionally used coir liners in wire baskets. I understand there are environmental concerns over the use of coir and traditional sphagnum moss liners. And I wonder if the advice team can suggest any sustainable alternatives. James, what are the issues around coir and sphagnum moss?
Okay, so sphagnum moss in particular was very traditional use in basket liners. It's really a natural resource which, you know, there's a danger of us using it quicker than it can replenish. So many people are familiar, for example, with stripping of peat bogs, and the industry has seen a big change in things like peat-free compost. And it's a similar kind of thing with the sphagnum moss, really. We need to limit how we use it and the quantities and so on. So people naturally will be looking for alternatives. As mentioned, cocoa fibre was something that had become very popular as a liner, because many people think of it as a waste product from the coconut industry. So therefore we're using what would have been a waste material. However, from an environmental point of view, the concerns really, I think, are more to do with the transporting of that material. Last time I looked, there wasn't that many coconuts growing, even in Cornwall. So the transport of that material, you know, has an environmental cost. So I think it's very good to look at some potential alternatives, and actually it's an opportunity for people to be a little bit creative around their gardens as well. If you happen to have any plants, for example, that may have particularly large leaves, that you may harvest a few and use those. So, for example, I've previously used things like gunnera leaves, or even leaves from rhubarb, things like that, which you can, while they're still flexible enough and there's enough moisture in them, sort of mould them into the shape of the basket, and then trim them appropriately. I've also seen, haven't tried this myself, but plaited phormium leaves, so sort of woven, so they're almost like a basket themselves.
Yeah,
and they can then, yeah, great. It looks fantastic. So that's another option. I think the only other thing I'd say, the final thing I'd say, is do be aware that when you're trying these things, if you put the soil straight in afterwards and then water, the first thing you'll notice is a lot of water and potentially some soil pouring out through the basket. So it may be worth recycling perhaps a little bit of plastic from an old compost bag or something like that, which can then help maintain a little bit of that moisture and stop it all running straight through.
Excellent advice. Michaela, now I noticed actually, I think you're muted on your microphone, Michaela, so you might have to unmute yourself, otherwise we won't hear your pearls of wisdom. Well, while we're waiting for Michaela, let's go over to well, I'm going to make a suggestion, actually. There we are. Well done.
Sorry, the internet went out.
Well, there we are. You see, this is the glories of technology. At least it is keeping us all connected, though, even if it does go wrong sometimes. Anything to add there, Michaela, in terms of alternative hanging basket liners?
You can buy from garden centres the cardboard already made liners, and then use them. Then when you've finished with them at the end of the season, you can use them in the compost. Just put them in the compost. And there are fabric ones that you can also buy off the roll. So you can buy a big sheet of it and then cut to size your actual liners.
Excellent. And I will add that you can also use the moss from your lawn.
Oh,
so, you
yes,
know, you
very good.
give your lawn a really good rake and you kill two birds with one stone. Great. Okay. So now from Carol Helm, excuse me, and now to Carol Helm from Kent. I've just constructed a raised bed and I'm planning on growing vegetables. Well, lots of us doing that at the moment. What can I still sow in late May that's fairly easy to grow and will still produce a harvest this year? Martin.
Well, you're spoilt for choice, Cal, because it's late May isn't late. It's an ideal time, really, for sowing because, you know, we've got warmth, we've got long days, and we've still got a good growing season ahead of us. So really, it's sky's the limit and what you like. But all the lettuces you can grow, all the different lovely salad leaves, mizunas and rockets, and the wonderful selection out there now from the seed companies. You can direct sow beetroot and carrots. If you're growing carrots, I would probably grow the fast maturing ones, the Nantes type, the early ones. Dwarf French beans, ideal to sow them direct rather than raise them as plants. Here's spinach, spring onions. It's literally sky's the limit. You can put everything in the garden now that you would have probably sown in late March or April. It's going to catch up and you'll still get a lovely crop in late summer.
Yeah, I love some of those, you know, the mixed leaf that are being offered by the seed companies now. We've got lots of those growing. James, anything to add?
I think actually this is, we get this question quite a lot, and it's a fairly common misconception that now is quite late for sowing. As Martin says, there's plenty of things that you can still try. I think if it's your first try at veg growing as well, it's always nice to get some fairly instant results to kind of boost your confidence. So maybe try some things like radishes, which give you a fairly quick turnaround. And also some of the leafy crops that Martin was mentioning there, some of the lettuces and salad crops. And then things that I think, you know, you just can't beat the taste if you're growing for the first time. So things like peas, eating peas straight from the pod is an experience that I challenge anyone to question. It's just completely different to anything you would have eaten before. So that would be my advice.
Yes, it is interesting, this conception that I wonder if it's because Chelsea takes place now. People think, oh, it's very late. Yeah. And as somebody who's done a couple of Chelsea gardens, you're tearing your hair out because it's actually so early in the year, really, in horticultural terms. So, you know, lots you can still do now. Right, so Sarah Fisher from Surrey has this question. I don't have a garden as such, but I do have a reasonably sunny paved courtyard. So all my growing is done in containers. This year, I'd like to try growing strawberries and would appreciate any advice on care when growing in containers and any recommended varieties, please. Michaela.
Yes, well, I would, if you're growing strawberries in containers, I would grow them in a glazed pot because that keeps the moisture in the container more. Strawberries are very thirsty plants when grown in containers. There are perpetual strawberries, which are smaller, but a longer cropping period. Then there's early, mid and late season strawberries. So pick when you're going to be there to pick them because they need to be picked very regularly. Some recommendations. Aramol is a perpetual one. Alice is a mid-season strawberry, and Symphony is a late season strawberry, and they've all got the RHS Award of Garden Merit. So they've all been trialled here at Wisley for their taste, colour and disease resistance.
Excellent. Always good to have some AGM suggestions. Martin.
Yes, I totally agree with everything there. It is getting a little bit late to plant them because traditionally strawberries would be planted in September to get them established to crop the following year, but you can plant them in the spring and get a small crop. You'll probably get a better crop next year, but what it might be worth looking out for, Sarah, is you can sometimes in garden centres and buy them online, you can buy what are known as cold stored runners. And this is what they use commercially, but we can buy them for our garden use as well. And basically they are good sized runners, young plants, bare root that have been lifted in the autumn and then put in a cold store, and they're kept at just a degree or two above freezing, and that keeps them in a state of sort of suspended animation. And when you plant them out, they will establish very quickly, and you can sometimes buy them bare root and they'll arrive through the post, or nursery will have bought them and put them in a small pot of compost. When you plant them out, they establish very quickly and crop usually in around 60 days, so a couple of months. And that's what they use commercially, and they can plan their cropping, and they're planting them out little and often. so they get a continuation of strawberry. So if you can find some cold stored runners, they would be perfect for planting now. And I'm just going to throw in another variety. The one I like to grow is one called Movein Centenary, which is an absolutely wonderful one. It's a really heavy cropper, beautiful, big, ripe, juicy strawberries. They are delicious. So try those.
Great suggestions. The village that we live in Rutland used to be the centre of strawberry growing in Britain once upon a time. And our house is actually called Whiteacres because when the strawberries were in flower, the whole of the valley was white with strawberry flowers. There's no strawberries grown here anymore, apart from mine in pots. Anyway, on to southeast London and Mr. Prince. I have an unheated greenhouse that I use predominantly for starting seeds and protecting tender plants from night frosts. I really struggle to maintain even temperatures and have recorded temperatures between 6 degrees C and 36 C over the last few weeks. Any suggestions on how I can achieve a more balanced temperature in an unheated greenhouse? I want the answer to this as well, actually. James.
Okay, so I'm actually in fairly close to southeast London myself, so I can sympathise with those temperatures. We've had some quite cool nighttime temperatures and some pretty warm days already for early spring. So completely understand and had the same issues in my own greenhouse. I think there's two sides to this. So in order to keep it cooler during the day, there's a few things you can think about. Firstly, venting is really important. So most greenhouses will have some kind of a roof vent, which you can open, which will allow some of the warmer air to escape. And they should also have some lower, they're normally slatted louvre vents, which will actually draw the cooler air in. So there's a kind of thermal effect going on here. The hot air is escaping from the top and the cooler air is being drawn in. So you've got an air movement, which is really important as well for the health of some of the crops that might be in there. So that's one way of helping keep it cool. Then, of course, there's various shading or netting that you can apply. So netting might be clipped to the inside frame of the greenhouse. Certainly that's something that you might consider doing, particularly through late spring and into the early summer if there's things still in there, because again, the heat could be a bit too intense. So shade netting. And there are products that you can paint directly onto the glass or spray onto the glass, which will also have the same effect, just reduce the amount of the sun's rays that are coming through. So that's a few things in terms of keeping cooler. The other thing you might want to do is dampen the floor down in the greenhouse as well. And that does two things. It can reduce the temperature, but it also increases the humidity. So the amount of moisture within the air. And again, that can be beneficial for young plants because if they haven't established a lot of root yet, having moisture in the air helps prevent them from drying out. So you tend to get a better success rate with some seedlings and some cuttings and things like that. In terms of the nighttime temperatures, keeping things a bit warmer, I mean, obviously, you stated this is an unheated greenhouse. So if you're not getting a heater in there, and you might want to consider something like a small paraffin heater or something if you haven't got mains electricity to the greenhouse. But if you're not using a heater, then think about insulation somehow. So it could be bubble wrap, or you can get fleece material, for example, that you can, again, line the inside or drape over a stand that has slightly more tender plants on it. And that just creates a kind of pocket of warmer air. And it can mean a difference of 2 or 3 degrees by using materials like that.
Yeah, I mean, I use bubble wrap. My greenhouse has got a glazing bar with a slot in it, so you can actually clip the bubble wrap to the slot. Now, not all greenhouses have that, of course, but that's quite useful because it makes it very easy to put in and take out. And I do find we had, it wasn't quite a frost, but we were probably a degree off a frost at the weekend. And the temperature was a decent 4 degrees warmer inside the greenhouse. So it does help. And I think that other point about putting a material, insulating material onto the plants is very important, because if you can't put bubble wrap up, and sometimes it's too tricky to do, or that you just can't physically fix it on, then protecting the plants close to the plant actually is just as important and works just as well. Excellent. Okay, so from South London, we're moving to North London. Dr. Biddington. I've recently moved and the new garden has quite heavy clay soil. I'm used to gardening on a lighter sandy soil, so was wondering if you could advise me on how to improve the soil conditions and also suggest some shrubs for clay soils. Well, clay soils, yes. Gosh, I remember the clay soil at Hyde Hall. God, we can make bricks out of that. Martin.
Yeah, no, sympathise. Although last time I moved 11 years ago, I went from the other way round, from sticky, horrible clay to a nice sandy loam now. Yeah, clay can cause problems. It's harder to work. It can be very wet and sticky in periods of heavy rainfall through the winter, and likewise when it's dry, it can bake hard. But it is, the good thing about clay is in dry weather, it does retain the moisture and it retains the nutrients as well. So it is a good, rich, fertile soil. I think the secret is to improve clay, and there is an element of work involved to start with, but the more organic matter you can work into it, the better. It just basically opens it up. It's very dense, is clay, and you need to open it up, get the air in there, improve the drainage, and get the worms working in there. So either digging in compost or manure, forking it in, or even just laying it on the surface, then the worms will eventually take it out. But I think you've got to do that little and often. It's no good thinking I'll blitz it once, put a load of manure on, and that's the problem solved, because when that breaks down, you're back to clay again. So it's something that you really need to continue to add to it to just improve your soil. So basically the answer is lots and lots of organic matter. Shrub wise, having gardened on clay, for really sticky clay, for 20 years, I used to find excuse me, most things would grow perfectly okay. It just sometimes takes them a little bit longer to establish. So you've just got to prepare the soil well. But a whole range of shrubs, you know, your berberis, your spireas, Philadelphus, deutzias, viburnums would all grow perfectly well on the clay. Just give them that little bit of extra tender helping hand to get them along the way.
Yes, and if you want some inspiration, Dr. Biddington, given that you're in North London, you could, when things are back to normal, whatever normal is, make your way up to Hyde Hall, the RHS Garden in Essex, which is on incredibly heavy clay, and get some inspiration from some of the planting there. Michaela, what have you got to add?
Hydrangeas, the Hydrangea paniculata types, they're really good in the late summer. Cone-shaped hydrangeas, usually white, but they tend to go pinky when the flowers get older. Garrya elliptica, James Roof is also another good evergreen, and things like hostas and herbaceous geraniums, all like clay soils.
Yeah, I think it's surprising what you can grow on clay. The secret is, as we've heard, though, it's about what you do to prepare it in the first place. But it is, you know, clay soil's not all bad news, but it does make your boots rot. That's the other thing I've found, anyway. So now we're off to Wiltshire, Mrs. Jones. The outer petals of my peony buds have turned brown, but on further investigation, the petals inside seem unaffected. What is this problem, and can I peel off the outer petals to save the flowers? Ooh, this sounds interesting, Michaela.
Yes, this is called flower balling, and it appears when the buds are just opening. If we get torrential rain, the water goes down into the bud, rots the petal, and then the sun comes out and then dries the petal and causes it to go brown. It can cause a mildew inside, so it would be better to get rid of the affected bud rather than try and take the damaged petals out.
Oh, that's a bit heartbreaking on a peony. If her peonies are anything like mine, they only have a few flowers on. But,
yeah,
I cherish every one. You know. Oh, anyway,
you can also put little, if you're an avid weather watcher, if there is torrential rain forecast, you can put yogurt pots on canes and put them over the flower buds to stop the rain from getting into the flower buds.
That is so Chelsea Flower Show as well. And the other thing that we do at Chelsea with the gardens is put a little bit of tissue paper around the iris buds and then tie them with a bit of string to stop them opening until judging day. And then you, yeah, heaven forfend if you actually forget to take one of those bits of paper off. Anyway, excellent advice. Thank you for that. So Frank McDonald from Derbyshire, he has a brick paved patio at the rear of his house. It's always covered with algae, moss and lichen. Oh, I like the sound of that. I regularly jet wash it, but it always returns. Can the team advise how else to tackle the problem?
Okay, so algae, moss, lichen normally more of an issue when their conditions are shady and the air is often quite still. So trying to remove it, particularly by maybe just by jet washing, might cause a problem, because although that might blast some of the material away, unless that water has got anywhere where it can drain well, you know, the conditions are still remaining damp. So first thing I would suggest is there any way in which we can change the light conditions and the amount of air coming into the space? So is it possible that there are overhanging trees or shrubs that could be thinned or pruned in order to let more light into the space? So that's one thing I would look at, because otherwise, whatever we suggest, the problem is probably just going to come back. In terms of actually removing, then I think you can't beat the sort of good old-fashioned stiff broom or even a wire brush that you can get on a long pole like a broom, and that will scrape most of it away. But as I say, if it's continuously wet and shady, the problem might come back. There are probably, there are on the market various things you can treat the patio with, but you know, you must follow the instructions carefully with these products, and be very wary of any plants and things that are around. So I would only really do that if you can't cure the problem by sort of physical means or by improving the conditions.
Martin, have you got anything to add?
Not an awful lot. I mean, I totally agree with James. I think that the problem is with some paving is if it's slightly porous, the moisture just sits in the paving, the surface of the paving or the bricks, and that creates that perfect condition for these lovely mosses and lichens and to grow. It can be a problem if it's that sort of slippery algae, and if it's wet, then it can be quite dangerous to walk on. So in those cases, yes, you need to do something with it, but it will always come back because there's no permanent way that you can get rid of it. You can brush it as much as you want, you can jet wash it, you can buy the patio cleaners. I would go for the ones that are based on fatty acids, pelargonic acid, the natural ones, because at least then any runoff won't damage any plants or harm insects or wildlife around. But they're only a temporary measure. They'll often say they'll keep the moss away for 6 months, but then when that's worn off and the conditions are right again, it grows. It's one of these things. It's just a plant trying to adapt to a situation. Some of them are very nice, of course, but it's not always what you want in your garden. So I'm afraid it's a job you've got for life, I think, getting rid of it.
Okay, I'd turn it into a Japanese garden, but there we are. So Mr. Barker from Norfolk, he lives close to the seafront. My front garden is sunny, but exposed to wind coming in from the sea. Could the advice team please advise on how to improve the garden's microclimate and suggest good plants for this location? Well, yes, I mean, seaside gardens can be tricky, and obviously salt-laden wind can cause a lot of damage to plants that aren't suitably adapted for those kind of conditions. I mean, there's certainly a few really good, robust plants that will tolerate those conditions, things like tamarisk, for example, Tamarisk gallica. There's some of the pines will do very well. And if you're looking for a sort of pine-like plant but without the size, you could go for Pinus mugo. A cultivar mops is one that's quite often grown, but there are others as well. The challenge, I think, for improving the microclimate is you're going to have to get quite a bit of depth of planting in order to make a real difference to the microclimate, because obviously, you know, if you're very close to the sea, then that's just a huge expanse that you're sort of battling against. So I'd focus more, if it was my garden, on growing those kind of plants that are resilient and can cope with the conditions. A lot of the ornamental grasses, for example. My mum's garden was at Bexhill-on-Sea, so I designed her garden for her and used a lot of grasses, the Stipa gigantea, which was very, very effective and looked fantastic, swaying around in the breeze. But James, what about other more sort of woody plants that Mr. Barker might add?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree 100%. You've got to use the plants that will do well in those conditions and that can cope with the wind. From a microclimate point of view, you might want to consider maybe establishing some kind of hedge, not a complete barrier, but something that could filter a little bit of the wind. So there are some shrubs in particular which tend to do well as seaside hedging plants, things like escallonia. And also Griselinia is another one which is quite wind and salt tolerant. And actually both of those plants have got quite a waxy surface to the leaf, and that actually minimises moisture loss. So as the wind is kind of whipping through them, they don't quite lose quite as much moisture through their leaves as some other plants would. So those kind of choices for hedges to try and then filter, slow down the wind a little bit. And then have a look at things that will cope with the conditions quite well. Noticed it's quite sunny, so there might be things like osteospermums, things like echinops and eryngiums, so the thistle-like, well, they often look good in seaside gardens, very architectural sort of plants. And then you often see quite a lot of palm-like, so Trachycarpus maybe, maybe even things like Phormiums cordylines, just to give you that kind of semi-tropical kind of seaside look.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so the next question, Mrs. Abrahams from Hertfordshire. Hello, advisors. I have a fairly steeply sloping south-facing bank, which needs plants to both help stabilize it and provide interest. Planting suggestions greatly appreciated. Martin.
Right, well, you're going to want things, obviously, I would have thought, to stabilize it. They're going to be fairly low growing, ground cover, probably root as they grow along there, and things with a fibrous root, so it's going to help to hold that surface of the soil together to stop it sort of washing down in heavy rain. So all sorts of ground cover plants that will grow in sort of sunny, dry conditions. We've already touched on things like vinca would be ideal. One I like is one called Pachysandra terminalis, which has got a lovely sort of quite apple green leaf, and it spreads, suckers up. So it can be a bit of a thug in some situations, but I think on your bank it would work well. And of course it's there all year round. If you wanted things slightly more shrubby, then again, some of the low growing ground cover Cotoneasters, Cotoneaster damari, Coral Beauty, they would work really well. They're evergreen, they've got flowers, they're good for attracting pollinating insects there, and the bees, and then the berries for the birds. There's another good ground cover called Rhubarb tricolor. It's related to the blackberry, but it's nothing like a blackberry. It's smaller leaf and nowhere near invasive, and that would work really well in that situation. And if you plant them in blocks, I think it would look very attractive, but it would stabilize your bank as well, and look good all year round.
James, what about you?
Yeah, some great plant choices there. I've also seen some that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see on banks. So things actually that you might consider climbers, things like Hydrangea petiolaris, which you might often see on actually a shady wall, but on a shady or sunny bank, they can actually act as a really good woody ground cover. And because of the way in which they root, and they have kind of like aerial roots from the stems, they actually offer a little bit more penetration and binding of the soil. So I've seen those on banks that have worked quite well. And it's interesting to see a plant in a different form, growing in a different place than you would normally see it. Similarly, Jasmine nudiflorum, winter jasmine, can be grown on banks like that as well. Martin mentioned Cotoneasters. There are also some reasonably low growing Ceanothus. So most people will be familiar with larger shrubby Ceanothus, but you can get some which are very low growing. And again, they might be useful for a sunny bank. And then from a herbaceous point of view, if you wanted something less woody, things like herbaceous geraniums, some of the low-growing euphorbias, perhaps not quite so, binding of the soil, but maybe lower down the bank, they can help sort of soften the edges.
Excellent. Okay, so to Jonathan Horn from Buckinghamshire. There's ivy growing on 2 sides of my house wall. Should I be concerned about potential damage to the walls or foundations? Michaela.
Firstly, don't let the ivy grow up into your eaves, under your tiles or your guttering. It only really affects the foundations if you're living in an older property that's not got very deep foundations. Don't prune in the bird nesting season. So leave till the autumn after the birds have left. It is a very insect friendly plant. So unless you're really worried about the foundations and you live on shrinkable clay, then I wouldn't worry about it. I would just keep it pruned away from your roof. It also acts as an insulator, so it keeps the house warmer in the winter and keeps it cooler in the summer.
Yes, it's a bit of a Marmite plant, isn't it, ivy, James, because it has all these benefits, but a lot of people just completely against it.
Yeah, and it's not an unusual inquiry for us as well. It's this kind of thing people see and automatically some people, assume it's a bad thing, and they are worried about the property and so on. In terms of damage to walls, it's worth pointing out that most evidence shows that the aerial roots and the way ivy clings to wall, it will only cause damage if there is already some kind of structural damage there. So if there's pointing in the brickwork that's flaking out, or if there's cracks in the walls, then it's possible that some of the ivy can get into those areas. But if it's a sound wall, the evidence for ivy damaging buildings is very minimal. As Michaela says, it's more of a problem when it gets into gutters or under tiles, because it allows water then to egress into the house and into the brickwork. And as she also said, that the wildlife, potentially the wildlife value of ivy is much greater than most people realise. And we are becoming aware of other properties, like insulation of the house. And we've seen quite a large increase in people planting climbers, not just ivy, but also looking at things like vertical walls, planting walls, and green roofs and so on.
Very good, thank you. So our next question is from Devon. It's a question about roses. This is from Mr. Appleby. I have many roses and some produce what I assume to be suckers from ground level. My questions are, how do you identify sucker growth, and how does it affect my roses, and what's the best way to solve the issue? Michaela.
Usually rose suckers come right from the base, where they're either grafted or the roots. They're usually growths that are very, very straight, and they have probably more leaflets than the actual rose plant. When you're weeding, try not to hoe around the base of the roses. Try and hand weed, because when you hoe, if you nick the base of the rose plant, that will encourage suckers to grow.
Very good. Okay, Simon Lamb from East Sussex. I'd like to create a new island bed on an area of my garden that's been part of the lawn for many years. The soil underneath is clay. Over the years has become quite compact. I've read conflicting advice as to whether double digging is required. Please can the team advise? Double digging. Oh, goodness.
Wow. This is always a hot topic, and certainly when I was in the teaching world, there was very pro diggers and very anti diggers, or no diggers. And you know, I think it is a bit more complicated than it originally seems, because I think it does depend on your individual situation. You have to weigh it up. Some may argue that if you've got a compact soil, or if there's a soil which might have a pan, like a layer underneath the surface which is hard to break through, then double digging might serve a purpose. After which you could probably just be applying lots of organic material and encouraging activity of worms and other soil creatures. Look, let's be honest, double digging is probably one of the most physical tasks anyone can do in the garden, particularly on a heavy soil. So you need to weigh all these things up and potentially look at other options. If you are going to do it, firstly do it at the right time of year, so late autumn into winter. Leave some of the larger clumps so the frost action can help break them down, so that does some of the work for you. Don't do it when the soil's too wet, because it will you'll just end up compacting the soil more and you'll get in a terrible mess. And dare I say, think about other options before you weigh up your decision. For example, can you create a taller raised bed, which might negate the need for the double digging? Single digging might be enough. So lots of things to think about.
I am a no digger, and I've just actually made a bed on a lawn using the no dig technique, and I've treated it's been my lockdown project basically. I started it the week that we locked down, and I've actually just started to plant it. So it's a seven-week process from putting a layer of cardboard down, lots and lots and lots of compost and organic matter on the top, and then it gradually breaking down. I like no dig because I'm essentially lazy. No, I mean I actually genuinely like it because you're retaining all the topsoil. You're not skimming all the topsoil off when you take the turf away. But I do take your point completely about compaction and subsurface soil issues, which sometimes require a bit more work. We've got time for 2 more questions, and the first one is from Mrs. Wells from Warwickshire. I have a few large rhubarb plants which produce far too many stems for my husband and I alone, but I don't want to waste the stem. Send them my way. I don't want to waste the stem. I love rhubarb. Any suggestions apart from sending them to me? In addition, I know the leaves are not edible, but can they be used for anything other than just composting them? Well, we've already answered this earlier on, I think, that using the leaves. Michaela, what would you say?
Well, I would say rhubarb freezes very well. You can make rhubarb and ginger jam. I know you can't give rhubarb away to your friends, but you could tell them it's on your gate and they could come and collect it, share it with your neighbours and friends. As we've said before, the leaves can be used for lining hanging baskets. You can also just place the leaves on the top of the soil and they will eventually rot down, rather than just putting them in your compost.
Excellent. Okay. And our last question is from Azim Khan from Derbyshire. And for many years, I've had a lavender edging to the path to the front door. Despite trimming after flowering, the lavender has now got woody and reached the end of its life. I'd like to try an alternative low-growing scented plant to edge the path. Any suggestions, please? Well, lavender, I mean, you have to be careful with lavender. I wrote an article for a national newspaper about lavender, and the whole gist of the article was that lavender is a, quote, short-lived plant. And I got a lovely letter from a lady in London saying, dear Mr. Wilson, a lovely article in the newspaper about lavender. I thought you might like to see this photograph of a lavender planted by my husband on his return from the Second World War. And there was this lavender in wonderful, rude health. It's like, oh, yeah, we do. Don't write. Anyway. Martin, what would you suggest as an alternative to lavender?
Well, I mean, lavender, I agree. I think it is, in most cases, especially if you have it as a hedge and you clip it, it's not a long-lived one. If you want to keep it nice and compact. If you don't want to put lavender in, there's various things. You could probably go down the herby root, really, if it's quite a short, compact one. I mean, hyssop is lovely as a herb. It's got sort of a minty, pepperminty scented leaf, and then you get these lovely blue flowers on it, and it's quite a compact plant. Well, only you can't see both hands, but it'll probably only go about a foot tall. You can give it a bit of a trim, and you get the scented foliage and the flowers. Sage I've seen trimmed, you don't get the flowers, but if you go for one of the variegated sages or the purple leaf one, it makes a lovely compact hedge. Or Santolina, if you go for the silver leafed one, again, nice and attractive, and if you don't clip it too much, you get the yellow flowers then in the summer. All have got aromatic foliage.
Excellent. James, anything to add?
I think if you want to keep the kind of classic, maybe blue purple like you would get from a lavender, then you could try something like Nepeta. There's some larger ones like Six Hills Giant, which would kind of match the height of some of the larger lavenders. They can grow up to 1 meter with their flower stems. Or there's a variety called Walker's Low, which is about 50 centimeters. So again, those lovely blue kind of spikes of flowers. If you wanted something a little bit woodier, you could perhaps have a look at some of the woodier artemisias. So not so much from flower, but really scented foliage as you brush past them, and quite a unique smell. So not everyone's cup of tea, but worth experimenting.
I've got Nepeta Six Hills Giant edging a path, and it works very well. And I've also got a couple of well, it's the prostrate rosemary 7C edging a path, and that works very nicely as well. And again, that especially on a hot day, you get the essential oils coming from it. It smells fantastic. Well, that's a good point to end today's session on, because tomorrow's topic is perfect plants. I think you've had a few perfect plants from us as well. So if you've any questions about plant maintenance, pruning, general garden care that you'd like to ask the panel tomorrow, head to the virtual Chelsea area of the RHS website and please send your questions in. The advice team tomorrow is going to be joined by garden designers Joe Thompson and Paul Herbie Brooks. So thank you for watching, and tune in again tomorrow at 1 p.m.